I never imagined that after 40 years of marriage, the man I thought I knew would betray me in the most painful way possible. The love I had built, the trust I had in him, it all crumbled in an instant. What followed was not just the end of a marriage, but the unraveling of everything I believed to be true about myself, my friends, and my life. If you think you know where this story is going, think again. The truth is much darker, and the revenge, it's far from what anyone could expect. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I promise, you won't want to miss what's coming next. My name is Linda, and for the better part of my life, I thought I had it all. A wonderful husband, 3 children who were mostly well-behaved, and a beautiful home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. David, my husband, was everything a woman could ask for. Charming, supportive, a great father. Or so I thought. For years, I had been the quintessential wife, organizing family dinners, maintaining our home, and making sure everything ran smoothly. I kept things in order, while David worked long hours, always on the move, climbing the ladder of success. We were the picture of stability, the type of family others admired. Our house, a sprawling property tucked away in a leafy suburb, was a symbol of everything we had achieved together. Our children, now grown, had their own lives, leaving David and me to focus on each other. But, as time passed, I started to feel the weight of being forgotten. It wasn't a dramatic shift. It was subtle. A moment here, a glance there. The affection we once shared seemed to slip away without warning, and I could feel David's attention drifting to other places. I told myself it was nothing. A phase, maybe. After all, we'd been together for so long, but in my gut, something didn't feel right. My best friend, Sarah, had always been my confidant, the one person I could rely on through thick and thin. Over the years, our bond had only grown stronger. Sarah had been my rock, or at least, I thought she was. She was always there, ready to lend an ear, especially when David became busier with his work. It was Sarah who always reassured me that everything would be okay, that David was just stressed or going through a work phase. I believed her. After all, if anyone knew David, it was Sarah. But then, the small cracks began to appear. One day, while I was sorting through some paperwork in our office, I found a receipt hidden under a pile of bills. It was for a weekend stay at a resort. The dates? Well, they were the same dates David had been away for a business trip. At first, I brushed it off. There could have been a logical explanation, right? A work retreat, perhaps? But then I found another receipt, and another. All the same hotel, all the same time frames. My heart sank. I didn't want to believe it. My mind screamed at me to stop, to ignore what I was seeing. But deep down, I knew. I knew that something wasn't right. I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling anymore. David came home late that night, as he often did, and I watched him with a new lens. How long had this been going on? How many lies had he told me? He smiled, kissed my cheek, and sat down at the dinner table as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The man I thought I knew had begun to slip away. I felt it in my bones. I needed answers. But how do you confront the love of your life when you suspect the worst? How do you ask someone to explain themselves when all you have is your gut and a handful of receipts? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. As I lay in bed that night, the weight of everything crushing me, I decided that I had to face the truth. I wasn't going to sit back and pretend anymore. Tomorrow, I would ask him. The truth would come out. I had to know because I couldn't live in this uncertainty. But what I didn't know yet was that the truth was far worse than I could have ever imagined. The morning after my sleepless night, I tried to act normal. I made breakfast, poured my coffee, and set the table for David, as I had done countless times before. But I could barely swallow the food I was preparing. The quiet hum of our kitchen seemed louder than usual, almost suffocating. David, as usual, was rushing around, late for his day's meetings, his mind somewhere else. I tried to shake off the overwhelming feeling in my chest, but it was like a heavy weight pressing down on me. We didn't talk much at breakfast. His mind was preoccupied, and I felt like a ghost in the room. As he grabbed his coat to head out the door, I hesitated. My fingers trembled slightly as I set my coffee cup down. "David?" I called, trying to sound casual, like this wasn't the moment that could change everything. "I need to ask you something." He turned, his expression neutral, and I saw a flash of impatience in his eyes. "What is it, honey?" "I'm already running late." I swallowed hard, wondering if I had the courage to confront him now. At this moment, I didn't. Instead, I said something trivial. "Have a good day," I murmured, watching him walk out of the door as if nothing were wrong, as if the storm brewing inside me didn't matter. But as soon as the door clicked shut behind him, I felt the suffocating weight of everything that had been left unsaid. The shadows had crept in quietly, and now they were too big to ignore. The day dragged on, every minute heavier than the last. I tried to keep myself busy, organizing, cleaning, answering emails, but my mind kept coming back to the hotel receipts. I couldn't shake the thought that something was happening, something that had been happening for a while, right under my nose. How had I missed it? It wasn't until the evening that the first real crack in my calm facade appeared. Sarah called, as she often did. I had been avoiding her calls all day, not because I didn't want to speak with her, but because I didn't know how to face her. I wasn't sure if I was ready to ask the questions I had been avoiding for so long. When I answered, her voice was light, casual, too casual, as if everything were fine. "Hey Linda, how's your day been? David told me you guys were going to take that weekend trip soon. You're still doing that, right?" The casual mention of that trip made my heart skip a beat. It was the same weekend David had stayed at that resort. Sarah had no idea I knew about it, and yet she was acting like it was all normal. Something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound calm. "I was thinking about it. Actually, I've been meaning to ask you something." "Sarah." I heard her voice tighten a little, almost imperceptibly. "Of course, anything." I took a deep breath. The words were harder to say than I had imagined. "Sarah, have you and David been spending a lot of time together? Just the two of you?" For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Then she laughed, an awkward, nervous laugh. "What do you mean? Of course we've spent time together. We're old friends, you know that." I could hear the tension in her voice. She was avoiding the question. "Right," I said, my voice dropping. "I just feel like, I don't know, something's different. Something's been off lately. With David, I mean." There was another pause before she responded. "Oh, honey, I'm sure it's nothing. You know how he gets when work piles up. Maybe you're just overthinking it. Everything's fine." "Really?" But I knew better. Sarah was a master at deflecting, and for the first time, I wasn't going to let her manipulate me into believing that everything was fine. I needed more than just reassurances. "I don't think it's nothing," I replied, my voice shaking now. "I think it's something." She hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Linda, don't go looking for things that aren't there. It's all in your head." I could feel the blood rush to my face, and for the first time, I saw Sarah not as my best friend, but as someone who was hiding something. I didn't press her any further, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew I had to confront David directly. "Okay, I'll talk to you later," I said, my tone sharp. "I need to go." As I hung up the phone, a sense of dread washed over me. The shadows were deepening, and I knew I couldn't ignore them any longer. Sarah had just given me the final clue. My best friend, my confidant, she was hiding something from me, and somehow I knew I wasn't going to like what I was about to find. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, replaying every interaction, every word, every glance. Something had changed between us, something deep and undeniable, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. The next day, I waited for David to come home. My mind was racing with a million thoughts, each one darker than the last. What would I say? How would I confront him? The questions burned in my chest, but I knew there was only one way to get the truth. As I watched the clock tick closer to evening, I felt a cold certainty settle over me. I was no longer going to wait. The truth would come out, whether David liked it or not. David came home that night, looking as charming as ever. He flashed his usual smile, kissed me on the cheek, and made some casual comment about how his day had gone. But to me, everything had changed. I felt a wave of nausea churn in my stomach as I forced myself to smile back. How could he stand there so unaffected when I was on the verge of unraveling? I waited for him to settle in, pour himself a drink, and kick off his shoes. The house felt too quiet. Even our dog, who usually barked in excitement when David arrived, seemed to sense the tension in the air and stayed curled up on the couch. "David, we need to talk," I said, my voice tight. He turned, his brow furrowing slightly. "What's wrong, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." I shook my head, trying to collect my thoughts, but the words were spilling out before I could stop them. I found something today. Some receipts. Hotel receipts. From that trip you said you were on for work, but you weren't there for work, were you? He froze, his eyes darting toward the door as if he was trying to come up with an excuse, a way out. His smile faltered, and for a brief moment I saw panic flicker in his eyes, but it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by a familiar calm that I now saw for what it was, a lie. "Linda, you're overreacting," he said smoothly, walking toward me. "You know how these things look, but they're nothing. Honestly, you're letting your mind run wild." His words sounded rehearsed, and I couldn't swallow them anymore. The man I had loved, the man I had built a life with, was standing in front of me, lying through his teeth. A coldness washed over me, and the weight of it felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. "You're not going to tell me the truth?" I asked, my voice trembling. "About Sarah? About the trips? About everything you've been doing behind my back?" David sighed, walking past me as if this conversation wasn't even worth his time. "Linda, please, I don't know what you're thinking, but you're jumping to conclusions. It's not what you think. You're being paranoid." I grabbed his arm, pulling him to face me. I needed to look him in the eyes. "Then tell me the truth. Please, David, I need to hear it from you." He yanked his arm away and took a few steps back. "You don't want the truth, Linda. You just want to fight." I was shaking now, every inch of me trembling with a mix of fury and heartbreak. "I don't care if you've been unfaithful to me. But I do care if you've been lying to my face, pretending everything was fine. And I care that Sarah, my best friend, has been part of this, helping you hide it." David's expression changed, his usual calm slipping for just a fraction of a second. "It's complicated, okay? It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I never meant to hurt you." "Don't you dare try to explain it away," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Don't you dare try to make me feel sorry for you." For a long moment, he just stared at me, his face unreadable. Then finally, he spoke. "You want the truth, Linda? Fine. Yes, I've been seeing Sarah, and I'm sorry. But it's over now. It wasn't anything serious, just a mistake." A mistake. Those two words hit me harder than any betrayal. It wasn't just a mistake. It was years of lies, years of deceit, all wrapped up in the form of the woman I had called my best friend. And all the while, I had stood by his side, trusting him, believing in the life we had built. I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They came in waves, choking me, but I didn't care. I was devastated, but more than that, I was furious. "You're unbelievable," I whispered, the words barely leaving my lips. "All this time, all these years, and this is how you repay me?" David looked at me with a mixture of guilt and indifference. He didn't know how to apologize, how to make it right, because in his eyes, this had never been about me. This was about him. He was the victim in his own mind, and everything he had done, every lie, every betrayal, was justified somehow. "You're angry, and I get that," he said, his voice soft now. "But please, Linda, don't make this worse than it is. We can work through this, okay? We've been through worse before, but we hadn't been through this before. Nothing like this. This wasn't something you could fix with apologies. The man I had loved, the father of my children, had broken me in a way I could never come back from." And as I stood there, listening to him, I realized something. There was no going back. I didn't want to hear his explanations, his excuses. I didn't care anymore. I knew, deep down, that it was over. And as I turned away from him, walking out of the room, I made a promise to myself. I would not let him destroy me. I would not let his lies and betrayal define me. The woman who had been broken in that moment was gone. A new woman, one who had learned to survive, would rise from the ashes. But that would come later. For now, I had to process this. I had to absorb it, and for the first time, I needed to let myself feel the depth of the wound he had inflicted. I had to let it consume me for just a little while longer before I could burn it all to the ground. I knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The following days blurred together in a haze of confusion, pain, and disbelief. David's words echoed in my mind like a broken record. "Yes, I've been seeing Sarah, and I'm sorry." I couldn't shake them. His cold admission, the way he casually dismissed everything we had built, gnawed at me. I was left in a storm of emotions, too angry to cry, too hurt to confront him again. It felt like my life had split into two parts, before I knew, and after. And the after was too painful to even imagine. But I had to know more. I needed to understand how deep the betrayal really went, how far back this had been happening. I wasn't going to live in the dark anymore, pretending everything was fine. If David could be so brazen with his lies, then I would find the truth myself. No more blind trust, no more pretending. I spent hours going through his things, picking apart his routine, examining every text message, every email, every conversation he'd had. What I found made my blood run cold. The receipts from the resort weren't just a one-off mistake. There were more, several more, and not just with Sarah, other women too. His infidelity had been a slow burn, something that had been happening under my nose for years. The hotel receipts stretched across several years, different women, different places. And the most chilling part? I hadn't known. I hadn't felt it. How was that even possible? How could I have been so blind? But it wasn't just the receipts. I found photographs, old ones, taken when we were supposed to be on family vacations. They were taken from the same resort, and in every one, David was there with someone else. I couldn't recognize the faces of the women, but the fact that he had been lying to me for years, sneaking around with them while I remained clueless, it crushed me. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the photos, my mind reeling. This wasn't just an affair. It was a betrayal so deep, so all-encompassing, that I didn't even know who the man in the photos was anymore. This was no longer the husband I had built a life with. This was a stranger. I wanted to scream, to rage, to confront him in the worst possible way. But I didn't. I couldn't. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down again. No. This time, I was done. The next evening, as I waited for David to come home from another long day of meetings, I knew it was time. I couldn't hold on to the lies any longer. I couldn't let him continue to manipulate me into thinking that I was overreacting, that this was all just a misunderstanding. When he walked through the door, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the receipts and photos spread out before me like a map of his betrayal. He paused, noticing the change in my demeanor. There was no warmth in his eyes, no familiarity, just a coldness that had settled between us. "Linda?" His voice held a nervous edge. I didn't say anything at first. I just stared at him, letting the silence hang in the air. I wasn't going to beg for answers anymore. I wasn't going to apologize for wanting the truth. Finally, I spoke. "How long, David? How long has this been going on?" His eyes flickered to the papers on the table, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. He swallowed hard, as if struggling to find the right words. "Linda, I can explain—" "No," I interrupted, my voice steady now. "There's nothing to explain. I already know everything. The hotel stays, the lies, the women, Sarah." His face turned pale, and for a moment, I thought I saw regret, real regret, flash across his features. But it was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by the same self-preserving demeanor he always wore. "Linda," he began, his voice tight, defensive. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I never meant to hurt you. You have to believe me." "Believe you?" I repeated, my voice growing louder, more incredulous. "Do you even hear yourself, David? You're standing here, in my house, lying to me again. Again! How many times do you think I can forgive you? How many times do you think I'll just ignore the truth because you say you're sorry? I'm done with your lies. I'm done with your excuses." He took a step toward me, but I held up my hand, stopping him in his tracks. "No, you don't get to fix this. Not this time. You've broken something inside me that can't be repaired." I stood up, walking to the door. My hands were shaking, but my voice remained steady. "We're done, David. I can't be with someone who has lied to me this much, who has used me, humiliated me, and done everything behind my back while I believed in our marriage." He tried again to apologize, but I couldn't hear it anymore. The words were meaningless. They had been for a long time. With one last look at him, I walked out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew this was it, the end of everything, the end of a life I had spent decades building. But somehow, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like a beginning. That night, I couldn't sleep. The finality of it all hadn't fully hit me yet. David was still in the house, but I felt like a stranger in my own life. It was a quiet, suffocating kind of loneliness. But I knew, deep down, that it was a loneliness I had to go through to finally break free from him. There was no going back. There was no saving this marriage. All that was left now was what I was going to do next. And that, I realized, was entirely up to me. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. I had a plan. I would rebuild. I would rise from the ashes. But first, I had to let myself feel the weight of it all. Even if it was the hardest thing I had ever done. David might have thought this was over for me, but I knew better. This was just the beginning. I wish I could say that it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but it didn't. The truth had come out, but the pain was still there, gnawing at me, spreading deeper with every passing moment. The anger, the humiliation, it all boiled inside me, and it seemed like nothing could soothe it. David, for his part, had tried to fix things. Of course he did. He was desperate. He had come to me on several occasions in the days following the confrontation, pleading for a second chance. But what he didn't understand was that the woman he was trying to convince to take him back didn't exist anymore. The woman who would have forgiven him had disappeared the moment I found the receipts, the photos, and the lies. He didn't get it. He never did. He was too focused on his own image, his own pride. And that's what made it easier to walk away. It was the realization that the man I had spent 40 years with wasn't really the person I had thought he was. The person I loved had been a lie. I didn't waste time trying to salvage the pieces of a broken marriage. I didn't even bother to listen to his excuses. He wasn't the man I needed anymore. Instead, I started making moves. David didn't know it yet, but I was already taking control of my life. I sold everything I could that was in both of our names, things I didn't care about anymore, things that had once represented a life we had built together. I sold off some of his prized possessions, too, things that I knew would hurt him. But it wasn't just the material things that mattered. It was about sending a message. I wanted him to feel the loss, feel the sting of his actions. If he thought that abandoning me would be easy, that walking away from all of this would come without consequence, he was wrong. When I sold the beach house, the place that had once been a sanctuary for us, where we had laughed and spent family weekends, it was the final act. I knew that it had been a place where he'd had those secret meetings with Sarah, and that thought alone made it all the more satisfying. I wanted him to lose it, to feel the sting of what he had done. That house was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, everything I had been blind to. It was a fitting end. Of course, David didn't know that I was the one orchestrating his downfall. He still thought I was wallowing in my grief, that I was too weak to make any real moves. But the truth was, I was building myself back up. I was already plotting my own escape from the wreckage he had left behind. The first few weeks were tough. I'll admit that. There were days when I couldn't get out of bed, when the tears came without warning. I had to fight every day to stay focused, to remind myself that I wasn't broken, that I could rebuild myself. But I did. I fought harder than I ever had in my life. I went to therapy. I started working out again. And slowly, the woman I had once been, the woman I had lost in the midst of my marriage, began to reappear. I started to feel stronger, more like myself. But that wasn't the most satisfying part. No, the real satisfaction came from seeing David's life begin to unravel. He had been so sure of himself, so confident that everything would fall into place once he left me. But it didn't. Sarah, his new love interest, wasn't the safe, stable option he had thought she would be. She wasn't satisfied with being the other woman, and when she saw the opportunity to take more for herself, she took it. She had always been ambitious, but now she was pushing David aside for someone else. And just like that, David was left with nothing. Sarah, who he thought would give him a fresh start, dumped him for another man. The very same man who had been part of their betrayal all along. The irony of it was almost poetic. He had lost everything, his marriage, his home, his pride, and now the woman he had risked it all for was gone too. I wasn't there to witness it, but I could feel the weight of it all the same. I knew that David, the man who had once held so much power over me, was now struggling in the mess he had created. He was powerless, and for once, I was the one who held the cards. Meanwhile, my life was beginning to take shape. I started a new career, something I had always wanted to do, but never had the courage to pursue. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. And every day, I felt more and more like the woman I had forgotten I could be. I didn't need David's approval. I didn't need anyone's approval. I was doing it on my own, without his shadow hanging over me. As the weeks passed, David's situation grew more dire. He had lost his job, his wealth, and now even his health was beginning to decline. The stress of it all was clearly taking its toll on him. Meanwhile, I was enjoying a new sense of freedom. I was making money, meeting new people, and feeling stronger than I had in years. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as I watched him spiral. The woman who had been so weak, so desperate for validation and love, was no longer there. She was gone, and in her place was a woman who had reclaimed her power, her confidence, and her sense of self-worth. David had lost everything, but I had found everything I needed within myself. One evening, as I was out with friends celebrating my latest achievements, I received a call from an unknown number. It was David. His voice was strained, his words slurred. "Linda," he said, his voice barely audible. "I need you. I need help." For a split second, I felt a pang of something, empathy maybe, but it didn't last. I knew what he wanted. He wanted me to rescue him, to fix the mess he had created. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I wasn't his savior. "I can't help you, David," I said firmly, the words feeling like a weight lifted off my chest. "You're on your own now." And just like that, I hung up the phone. I had no regrets. This was the life I had chosen, the life I was now building for myself, and it was mine to keep. David was no longer my problem. I thought I had hit the bottom when I found out about David's betrayal. But the truth was, I hadn't even scratched the surface. The pain didn't come from the discovery of his affair. It came from the reality of losing everything I thought I knew about myself, about him, and about the life we had shared. What I had been holding in my chest for so long was now rushing to the surface, threatening to drown me in its weight. I had always prided myself on being the strong one, the rock, the constant presence in David's life and in the lives of my children. I was the one who held everything together, the one who made sure the house ran smoothly and everyone was cared for. I thought that by doing all the right things, by being the perfect wife and mother, I would be rewarded with loyalty, love, and respect. But as it turned out, all my effort, all my devotion, had been nothing more than a disguise for David's lies and betrayal. And as for Sarah, she had been a part of that lie, wearing the mask of my best friend while stabbing me in the back. I spent the first few days after the confrontation numb. I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Yes, I was angry. But it wasn't just anger. It was the sense of having been robbed of my dignity, my time, and my belief in people. How could I have been so blind? How had I spent years of my life trusting a man who was deceiving me? How had I been so easily manipulated by someone who never even cared? Every little detail of our life together became a lie, a carefully constructed facade that hid the truth beneath it. The vacations, the anniversaries, the quiet evenings at home, none of it had been real. The love I thought we shared, a lie. The family we had built, a lie. Even Sarah, the one person who had always been by my side, was just another player in the game of deceit that had been unfolding right in front of my eyes. The realization hit me harder than anything else. It wasn't just about David and Sarah. It was about me, about how I had let myself be consumed by the roles I played, wife, mother, friend, at the expense of who I was. I had become so wrapped up in the image of the perfect life that I had forgotten to look beyond it, to see the truth of what was happening around me. I thought I was the person who had it all together, the woman who had everything, love, family, a home. But I wasn't that woman anymore. The real woman, the one I had lost along the way, was buried beneath years of expectations and self-sacrifice. I had given everything for others, and in return, I had been left with nothing. I wasn't just heartbroken, I was shattered. The first night after David left, I stayed up late, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the fragments of my life. I cried until there were no tears left, until I was exhausted and numb. But sleep never came. The house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth now felt empty. The silence was deafening. Every corner of the house reminded me of the life we had built together, the life I thought was solid, secure, unshakable. But it had been nothing more than an illusion. When I woke up the next morning, the weight of the night before was still heavy on my chest. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to face the reality of what had just happened. But I had to. I had children to think about, a life to rebuild, and for the first time in years, I had to focus on myself. That was when the anger really began to set in. I had spent too long pretending to be the perfect wife, The perfect mother, the perfect friend. I had sacrificed pieces of myself along the way, and in return, I had received nothing but betrayal. I wasn't going to let that be my legacy. I wasn't going to stay broken, wasn't going to let David's lies define me. I had to find a way to take back my power, and I would start by doing what I should have done years ago, taking care of myself. The anger, as overwhelming as it was, became my fuel. I didn't want to be the victim anymore. I wasn't going to wallow in pain or regret. I was going to use this anger to rebuild my life, to reclaim my independence. I was going to take back the pieces of myself that I had given away for so long. And that meant not just focusing on my own healing. It also meant making David feel the consequences of his actions. I wasn't going to sit idly by and watch him move on with Sarah, while I was left to pick up the pieces of our broken life. He had hurt me, humiliated me, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. That week, I made a decision. I started planning. David had always been the one in control, the one who made the decisions, the one who held the power in our relationship. But that was about to change. I was going to take back control. I wasn't going to let him or Sarah have the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I started by contacting a lawyer, getting everything in place for the divorce. I didn't need to consult David on the decision. I knew it was time to let go of him. But more than that, I knew it was time to let go of everything that had tied me to him, everything that had made me feel small, invisible, and worthless. The house, the beach house, the money, it was all going. I didn't care. I was reclaiming what was mine. And as I made the calls, sold the possessions that had been tied to him, and began to make a life for myself, something inside me started to shift. The pain didn't go away, but the numbness started to fade. I was still angry, still hurt, but I was no longer afraid. I wasn't afraid of being alone, of being without him, of starting over. The world felt like it was at my feet. I couldn't stop the tears, not yet, but I didn't need to. I wasn't just healing, I was evolving. Every decision I made, every move I took, felt like a step toward my true self. I wasn't going to be a victim. I wasn't going to be the broken woman who had been left behind. I was going to be the woman who walked away from the wreckage, stronger and more determined than ever. And I was going to make sure David and Sarah would never forget the price of their betrayal. As the days turned into weeks, I began to understand something that had been hard for me to admit. David's betrayal wasn't just about him sleeping with Sarah. It wasn't just about the house, or the lies, or the humiliation. What hurt the most, what felt like the deepest wound, was the realization that I had been living in a lie for years. It wasn't just one affair. It wasn't just Sarah. David had been unfaithful to me for much longer than I had ever imagined. And when I began digging, when I started asking the right questions, I uncovered a truth I had never seen coming. David had been cheating on me for years, with multiple women, and Sarah wasn't the first. The gut-wrenching discovery came slowly. First, I found another set of receipts: hotel bills, plane tickets, gifts. They were all from places I hadn't been, places I had never even known about. And they were from years ago, long before Sarah had entered the picture. That's when the nausea hit me. The life I had been so sure of, so certain of, was built on nothing but a string of lies. I wasn't just betrayed by one woman, I was betrayed by him, over and over again. The more I searched, the more I found. A few late-night phone calls that I thought were business calls were actually from lovers. Emails that I had never seen, messages buried in his inbox. Each one confirmed what I had been unwilling to see. I could barely breathe as I looked at the messages, each one more intimate, more secret than the last. David, the man who had once been my everything, had spent years lying, deceiving, and betraying me in ways I couldn't have imagined. My heart broke all over again. The shock of it was almost unbearable. How could I have been so blind? How could I have missed it all? And the worst part was, I had believed in him, believed in our marriage, in us. For all those years, I had stood by him, supported him, believed his lies. I had given him everything, and he had given me nothing but deceit. But as the truth began to settle in, something shifted inside me. The anger I had been holding on to, the overwhelming sense of betrayal, began to fade into something more powerful. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't just about making him suffer. It was about my own redemption. It was about reclaiming my life, my identity, my sense of self. I had spent too long being the woman everyone else wanted me to be. The perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect friend. I had given everything to others, and I had lost myself in the process. But now, I was reclaiming the pieces of myself that I had sacrificed. I wasn't going to let David's lies define me any longer. I was done with being the victim. I wasn't going to cry myself to sleep over a man who didn't deserve me. I didn't want revenge in the traditional sense. What I wanted was freedom. I wanted to stand tall again, to feel strong, to take back everything that was mine. And in order to do that, I needed to face this truth head on. The next morning, I gathered the strength to sit down and really think about what I wanted to do. I made a list of everything I had to let go of, everything I had to rebuild. But most importantly, I wrote down what I wanted for myself, what I deserved. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to dream about a future where I wasn't defined by David's betrayal. As I sat in the quiet of the house, looking at the papers spread before me, I realized that this wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the end of a life I had outgrown. This was my chance to start over, to finally live the life I had been too afraid to pursue. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be mine. And that was the most liberating feeling I had ever had. David, for his part, was still trying to make sense of everything. He didn't understand how I could just let go so easily. He kept coming around, trying to fix things, to convince me that he was sorry, that he would do anything to make it right. But I wasn't interested in his apologies anymore. I didn't want his pity. I didn't want his remorse. I wanted him to understand one thing. I had already made my peace with everything, and that peace didn't include him. One afternoon, I ran into him while I was out for a walk. It had been weeks since we last spoke, and seeing him again made my stomach twist in an odd mix of anger and relief. He looked lost. His face was haggard, his clothes more disheveled than I had ever seen. He had clearly been struggling, clearly suffering from the aftermath of everything he had done. "Linda," he said softly when he saw me, his voice strained. "Can we talk?" I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to hear his excuses or listen to his pleas for forgiveness. But I stopped, just for a moment, because I needed to hear him. I needed to hear him admit, one last time, what he had done. "You don't get to fix this, David," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You've already broken me, and there's no going back from that." He looked at me, his eyes wide, as if trying to understand how I could be so composed. But that was the point. I wasn't the same woman anymore. I was no longer the broken woman who had depended on him for validation and love. I was stronger than that. He sighed, his face falling as if the weight of everything was finally sinking in. "I never meant to hurt you, Linda. I never meant for any of this to happen." I looked him dead in the eye. "But you did, and now you're going to have to live with it." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, just as broken as I once had been. And for the first time in my life, I didn't look back. As the weeks passed, I continued to rebuild. I went back to therapy, joined a new gym, and started making plans for my future, plans that didn't involve David. And with every step forward, I felt stronger, more confident, more like the woman I had once been before all of this. David was still in the wreckage of his own making. His life was crumbling around him. And Sarah, the woman who had betrayed me with him, had moved on to someone else. I couldn't help but feel a strange satisfaction in knowing that they both got what they deserved. But the real victory wasn't in watching them fail. It was in watching myself rise again. I was no longer defined by their lies. I was defined by my own strength, my own ability to survive, to thrive, and to rebuild. I wasn't going to be a victim anymore. And no matter what, I was going to make sure David knew that. It had been months since David and I last exchanged words. The divorce was moving forward, but I knew deep down that I wasn't doing it just for legal closure. I was doing it because I needed to strip him of everything he thought he could walk away with: his pride, his comfort, and especially his sense of control. What he had taken from me over the years, I would now take back, piece by piece. As much as I had begun to heal emotionally, I couldn't shake the feeling that David hadn't truly suffered. Sure, his life was falling apart. He had lost his career, his home, and Sarah, who was now nowhere to be found. But he still carried the arrogance, the sense of entitlement that had always surrounded him. It was time for him to feel the full extent of his actions, and I was going to be the one to make sure of it. The first step was simple. I started by selling everything that was in both our names, the joint bank accounts, the expensive cars, and even some of the properties we had invested in. It wasn't just about the material things. It was about sending a message. David had always lived in a world where everything he wanted was handed to him, and now I was making sure that world crumbled. The house, the beach house that had once been our escape, our refuge, was the first to go. The same house where he had taken Sarah, where they had shared their secret rendezvous. It had been our place, our sanctuary. But now, it was the symbol of everything I had been blind to. I listed it, and before David could even come to terms with the loss, it was gone. The look on his face when he found out was priceless. He came to me, demanding to know why I had sold it, as if he still had the right to question my decisions. But I wasn't about to entertain his desperation. "You don't get to make demands anymore, David," I said coldly, as he stood there, trying to regain some semblance of control. "That house was the last thing you had left. Now, it's mine to do with as I please." He tried to argue, to manipulate me the way he always had, but the power had shifted. I wasn't his wife anymore. I wasn't even the woman who had once loved him. I was someone new, a woman who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to take what she deserved. He left that day, his face red with anger and humiliation, but I felt nothing but a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just about the house. It was about stripping him of his ability to hide behind the life he had created at my expense. The next step came soon after. I filed for a larger share of the assets. I wasn't going to let him walk away with what he had gotten so easily over the years. It wasn't about the money. It was about showing him that he couldn't take me for granted anymore. The more I pushed, the more David fought, and it felt good to see him lose his footing. The confidence he had once held so easily slipping away. But I wasn't done yet. I needed him to understand just how thoroughly he had destroyed everything that mattered to me. And the only way to do that was to make him feel the consequences of his actions. The emotional toll, the social consequences. He had humiliated me with his infidelity. Now it was my turn. I began reaching out to some of the people who had once been part of David's inner circle, friends of his, business associates, people who had admired him from afar. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know how much of his life was built on lies, and I was more than willing to share the truth with them. I wasn't doing it out of spite. Well, maybe a little. But it wasn't just about revenge. It was about my healing, about standing in the light of everything I had learned, and finally owning my story. If David was going to live in a world of secrets, then I was going to make sure that world came crashing down around him. I wasn't going to let him go unscathed. Not this time. It wasn't long before whispers started. People began talking about David's infidelities, his lies, his arrogance. His reputation, which had once been so carefully crafted, began to crumble. The businessman who had been admired for his success was now seen for what he truly was, a man who had betrayed the very people who had supported him. David didn't know how to react. He tried to salvage his image, to make excuses, but the damage had already been done. People started pulling away from him. His phone stopped ringing. Invitations to business meetings and social gatherings dwindled. And the harder he tried to hold on to the life he had once taken for granted, the further it slipped from his grasp. But I wasn't finished. Watching his world crumble wasn't enough. I wanted him to feel the way I had felt, the ache of losing everything you thought you could rely on. I wanted him to understand the depth of his betrayal, to realize that nothing would ever be the same again. The final piece of my plan was simple, but it was the one that would hit him the hardest. I reached out to Sarah. I didn't contact her out of revenge. I was beyond petty confrontations. But I knew something that David didn't. I knew that Sarah had moved on. She had found someone else. And this time, it wasn't just another affair. She was gone for good. When I called her, I kept it short and to the point. I wasn't interested in rekindling a friendship. Those bridges had long since burned. I simply told her the truth. He's alone now, Sarah. He's going to need you to help him pick up the pieces. But he's not worth it. I hung up before she could respond. David eventually found out that I had spoken to her. He came to me, furious, demanding an explanation. But I didn't care anymore. I didn't care about his anger or his accusations. I was done trying to appease him. "Everything you've built is gone," I said, watching his face twist in disbelief. "You're alone now, David, and you'll stay that way. Sarah isn't coming back. She's gone for good, and I'm not going to save you anymore." And for the first time in years, I saw the man I had once loved shrink in front of me. He wasn't the powerful man who had once controlled my life. He was a broken man, and it was the most satisfying thing I had ever seen. The satisfaction wasn't in his downfall. It was in mine. I had taken control of my own life. I had reclaimed what was always mine. David had no idea how far I was willing to go to regain my power. But now, I knew that I was stronger than I had ever been before. And as I walked away from the wreckage of my marriage, I felt free for the first time in years. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about freedom. And I was finally free. It had been a few months since I had made my decision to let go of the past. It felt like the air around me was lighter, even though the world I once knew had been shattered. David was nowhere to be found. His pride had been broken, his reputation destroyed, and his world crumbled into something unrecognizable. I could feel the weight of his absence, but there was something liberating about it. I had finally freed myself from a life I didn't even recognize anymore. I had done what I needed to do, not for vengeance, but for my own growth. The satisfaction of seeing David's world fall apart wasn't rooted in petty revenge. It wasn't about watching him lose everything. It was about reclaiming my own life. It was about realizing that I wasn't the victim anymore, and that I didn't need him or his validation to feel worthy. But while I was watching David struggle, my own healing journey had begun. I was doing things for myself that I had never thought possible before. Therapy was helping me to unpack years of emotional baggage that I had carried around like a weight. I was working through the grief, the betrayal, and the anger. But more importantly, I was learning how to live for myself again, something I hadn't truly done in decades. I went back to school, enrolled in classes I had always dreamed of taking but never had the courage to pursue. I started working at a local charity, helping women who were going through similar struggles. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when the pain of everything I'd lost washed over me. The quiet evenings, the memories of happier times, the feeling of having someone by my side. But every time those memories crept in, I reminded myself that I had lived through it. I had survived it. I was strong enough to rise above it. One day, while I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, I thought back to all the years I had spent trying to please David, trying to be everything he wanted, all the while neglecting myself. I had spent decades of my life being the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect friend. But I had forgotten the most important person in that equation, me. And now, for the first time in my life, I was living for me. I was doing things that made me happy, that made me feel fulfilled. I wasn't waiting for someone else to tell me I was worthy. I had learned to tell myself that I was worthy of happiness, peace, and joy, even if I had to fight for it. Months later, I ran into an old friend from my past, Paul. He had been a friend of David's, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. But Paul had always been kind, always treated me with respect, something I hadn't gotten much of in recent years. We caught up over coffee, and as we talked, I could feel a connection forming again. A bond that wasn't based on the lies or the pain of the past. It was based on mutual respect, shared interests, and a quiet understanding of each other's journeys. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen. I felt heard. Paul had always been there, in the background, supporting me from a distance, but never pushing. He admired my strength, my resilience, and the way I had handled everything that had come my way. It felt good to hear someone recognize the strength in me that I had worked so hard to rediscover. He wasn't here to save me or fix me. He simply saw me for who I was, someone worthy of love, respect, and companionship. Over the following months, Paul and I grew closer. We started spending more time together, doing things that brought us both joy. Hiking, attending art exhibits, trying out new restaurants. There was no rush, no pressure. We were simply two people who understood each other's pain and were learning how to heal together. It wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't the passionate whirlwind romance I had dreamed of in my youth, but it was something deeper. It was quiet, steady, and real. It was a friendship that was blossoming into something more, but at a pace that felt natural, that felt right. I continued my journey of rebuilding, piece by piece. I focused on my work, my passions, and my health. I was no longer afraid of the future. I had been broken, but now I was stronger than I had ever been. Every day was an opportunity to grow, to learn, to become the woman I had always been meant to be. And then, one day, as I was walking down the street with Paul, laughing about something silly, I realized something profound. I had finally forgiven myself. I had spent so long blaming myself for everything that went wrong in my marriage. I had carried the weight of David's actions as though I were responsible for them. But I wasn't. I wasn't responsible for his betrayals, his lies, or his choices. I had done the best I could. I had given him my heart, my trust, and my loyalty. And for that, I deserved respect, not betrayal. Once I forgave myself, I could finally let go of the last remnants of pain that still lingered in my heart. I was free, not just from David, but from the chains I had placed on myself. I was no longer defined by my past or my mistakes. I was defined by who I was now, strong, independent, and unbreakable. I ran into David one last time. It was a chance meeting, completely by accident. He looked different. He had aged, the stress of his failed marriage and business ventures taking their toll. He didn't seem like the same man who had once been my everything. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet sadness. When he saw me, he hesitated, unsure of how to react. But I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I just felt nothing. The man who had once broken me no longer had the power to hurt me. We exchanged a few words, nothing meaningful. Just the awkward pleasantries of two people who used to share everything, but now shared nothing. As I walked away, I realized that the final chapter of our story had already been written. It was over. I had closed the book, and the weight of it no longer carried me. I was free. The life I had now wasn't perfect. It wasn't the life I had envisioned when I was younger, full of dreams of love and happiness. But it was mine. It was real, and it was finally enough. And as I looked ahead, I saw a future filled with possibilities that were all mine to claim. No more living in the shadows of the past, no more playing the role of the broken wife or the betrayed woman. I was Linda, just Linda, and for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. The sun was just starting to set when I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, overlooking the city that had become my sanctuary. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a modest space, but it was mine. It was a place I had chosen for myself, where I could begin again, free from the past that had once felt like a heavy weight around my neck. The quiet hum of the city felt comforting, a backdrop to the life I was now building. In the distance, the sound of cars, people talking, the occasional laughter, it all reminded me that the world kept turning, whether I was ready or not. But the difference now was that I was no longer waiting for something to change. I had already changed. I hadn't realized how far I had come until that moment. The pain of my marriage, the betrayal, the endless nights of crying and questioning my worth, it all felt so distant now. It wasn't that I had forgotten or erased those memories, but they no longer defined me. The woman who had once been crushed by David's lies, who had spent years thinking that her value was tied to being a perfect wife and mother, had been reborn. And in her place was a woman who finally understood her own worth, a woman who didn't need to rely on anyone to feel complete. I thought about all the things I had done since David's betrayal, the trips I had taken on my own, the friendships I had rekindled, the career I had built from the ground up. The last few months had been a whirlwind of self-discovery. I had finally begun to do the things that made me happy, and I had found a strength within myself I never knew existed. I had stopped apologizing for my happiness, for my needs, and for my desires. And then there was Paul. I had always liked him, even when he was just a shadow in the background of my life. He had been David's friend, but he had never treated me as an accessory to my husband. He had always been kind, thoughtful, someone I could count on during the darker days of my marriage. But it wasn't until recently that I saw him for who he truly was, a man who respected me for who I was, not for who I was married to. Our friendship had grown naturally, no rush, no pressure. He was supportive, but not in the way I had grown accustomed to men being supportive in my life. It wasn't about saving me from myself or trying to fix what was broken. Paul respected me in a way that allowed me to simply be me. And over time, that respect turned into something more. But it was different from everything I had experienced with David. There was no pretense, no power games, just two people learning about each other and sharing life's simple moments. He wasn't my knight in shining armor. He didn't need to be. What he offered was simple, but it was everything I had been craving. Companionship, mutual respect, understanding. He gave me space to be myself, and that was something I hadn't realized I needed until I had it. And though I wasn't sure where it would go, I knew that the relationship we were building wasn't based on the mistakes of the past. It was based on the present, and that, in itself, felt like a gift. As the weeks went by, David's presence in my life became more of a distant memory. I didn't hear from him much. He had left behind the man he once was, the man I had loved, and in his place was a hollow shell of what was once a confident businessman. But I didn't feel pity for him anymore. I didn't feel anger. What I felt, finally, was indifference. He was a part of my past, a past that had shaped me but no longer held me captive. I remember the day he called me, not to apologize, but to ask about his things, some of the items he had left behind in the house. I didn't rush to respond, but when I did, I didn't hesitate to make it clear that he was no longer a part of my life. "David," I said calmly, "I've already moved on. What's left of our life together is packed away in a box, and that's where it stays." There was a silence on the other end of the line. For the first time, I could hear the man who had once been my partner truly realize that I wasn't coming back, that there was no more hope for reconciliation. I wasn't angry with him. I was simply done. The woman who had once cried herself to sleep over him no longer existed. "I don't want anything to do with you anymore," I added softly. "Not now. Not ever again." And with that, I ended the conversation. I wasn't being cruel. I was being honest. I was finally free. Life continued to move forward, and I found myself in a new rhythm, one that was entirely my own. I didn't have to live up to anyone's expectations anymore. I didn't have to prove myself to anyone. I took time to reconnect with myself, rediscovering hobbies I had neglected, and finding joy in the little things again. I traveled to places I had always wanted to visit, and each time I returned, I found more of myself in the process. I wasn't just existing anymore. I was living. The pain was still there in some quiet corners of my heart, but it was no longer something that controlled me. It was just a part of the journey, a scar that reminded me of how far I had come. I wasn't afraid of the past anymore. It had made me who I was today, and today, I was someone strong, someone who knew her worth. One evening, I found myself standing on the balcony, staring out at the skyline, feeling the breeze against my skin. I didn't have to look back. The past was behind me, and what I had ahead of me was all that mattered. I was finally free to write my own story, without the shadows of betrayal clouding my path. I had faced the storm. I had walked through the fire. And now, here I was, stronger, more resilient, and ready to embrace whatever came next. It was my time, and I was finally ready to live it. The future was wide open, and for the first time, I didn't need anyone else to show me the way. I had found it myself, and that was enough. The months had passed, and as much as I had moved forward, there were still days when the weight of everything I had been through seemed to hit all at once. It wasn't that I hadn't found peace. It was that I had found something far more meaningful, the strength to live a life I controlled, the pain, the betrayal. It all felt like part of the old me now, like a chapter in a book I had finished reading. But there were days when I could still feel the faint echoes of those chapters, the ones that hurt, the ones that almost broke me. But now, I saw it all differently. I saw it as a test, as the fire that had forged a version of myself that I didn't even know was possible. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I had spent so long being consumed by David's actions, by Sarah's betrayal. But that was the past, and I had made the choice, over and over again, to let go of it, to let go of the person I thought I was and embrace the woman I was becoming. I had gone through moments of intense vulnerability, where the grief of what had been lost felt suffocating. But there were also moments of profound joy, moments when I realized that the life I had now was mine to shape. The future was in my hands, and for the first time in a long time, I felt empowered. I was no longer trapped in the story of David and Sarah's betrayal. I was creating my own story, and it was far more powerful than I had ever imagined. Paul and I had continued our quiet, steady journey together. We weren't rushing anything, but the connection between us had deepened in ways that surprised me. With him, I didn't feel the pressure to be anything I wasn't. There was no drama, no games, just two people figuring out who they were, together, without the weight of past relationships dictating what we should be. We spent weekends exploring the city, going to art galleries, hiking through the parks. Sometimes we just sat together in the quiet of my apartment, reading or talking about the things that mattered to us, life, dreams, and the future we were both cautiously starting to see. There was no rush, no pressure to become something we weren't. It felt good to simply be. The best part of being with Paul was the way he made me feel like I was already enough. There were no expectations, no trying to live up to anyone else's standards. He respected me for who I was, and in that respect, he was different from anyone I had known before. With him, I was free to be my authentic self, without the past hanging over me like a cloud. I couldn't help but think back to the early days of my marriage with David, to the woman I was back then. The woman who thought her worth was tied to the success of her marriage, to keeping everything together, to being the perfect wife. How wrong I had been. Now, I knew that my worth was inherent. It was never about being someone's perfect partner or a dutiful wife. It was about knowing who I was and standing firm in that knowledge. It was about living for me, without fear of judgment, without constantly questioning if I was enough. One afternoon, as I was walking to meet Paul for lunch, I ran into someone I hadn't expected to see, David. He looked different, disheveled, tired, and older than I remembered. His once confident air had faded, replaced with a defeated look that was so stark it was almost unrecognizable. For a split second, I hesitated. I hadn't seen him in months. He had become a shadow in my life, someone who no longer held any significance in my world. But as he stood there in front of me asking how I was, I felt no anger. I didn't feel pity either. I felt nothing but the space between us, the distance I had created, the strength I had built. "Linda," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect to see you." "I didn't expect to see you either," I replied, my tone neutral. I had no desire to dredge up the past, no desire to hear him apologize or beg for forgiveness. What had happened between us was done. "I know things ended badly," he said, his voice strained. "I just wanted to apologize for everything." I looked at him, studying his face. He seemed so small, so broken. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel a need for vengeance. I had already taken everything back I needed from him. The power, the control, the pieces of me that he had stolen. "I appreciate the apology," I said, my voice calm, measured. "But honestly, David, I don't need it. I've moved on. I've let go. And I'm happy now." His face fell. The man I had once loved seemed to shrink before my eyes. There was nothing left of the confident businessman I had known. There was just a man who had lost everything, including himself. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what I did to you," he said again, his voice faltering. "I know you're sorry," I said, "but the truth is, I'm no longer the person you betrayed. I've changed. I've moved forward, and I'm at peace with that." There was a long pause, and I saw the realization hit him. This wasn't just an apology I was accepting. This was closure, for both of us. "Goodbye, David," I said softly, stepping around him and continuing on my way, and with that, I finally let go. For good. The future stretched out before me, wide and full of possibilities. I wasn't weighed down by the baggage of my past anymore. I wasn't waiting for some external validation. I had found everything I needed within myself, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. I wasn't looking for a perfect life. I wasn't searching for someone else to complete me. I was complete on my own. And as I walked forward, I did so with the quiet confidence of a woman who had been through the fire and come out stronger on the other side. I had reclaimed my life, my power, and my peace, and now I was finally living it. It's strange, you know, how life can change in ways you never expect. There was a time when I thought I had it all figured out, when I thought I knew what my future held, but life had other plans. And now, as I look back on everything that's happened, I realize that the journey I've been on, the one I never could have predicted, was the most transformative of all. I had always believed that the end of my marriage with David was the hardest thing I would ever face. And don't get me wrong, it was hard, but it wasn't the end of me. It wasn't the end of my happiness or the beginning of some endless sorrow. It was just a chapter, one that needed to be closed so a new one could begin. The woman I had been during that marriage was lost in so many ways. She was the version of me that thought her value was tied to a man, to a relationship. She thought that in order to be loved, she had to give everything, her time, her self-respect, her identity. But that woman was gone now. And the woman standing here today is stronger, more confident, and more sure of her own worth than ever before. I still remember the first few months after the divorce, the emptiness that filled the house. There were times when I felt completely lost, like I had nothing left. But then there were moments of clarity. I realized that in those quiet moments, I was finding myself again. I was discovering who I was without the labels of wife or mother. I had spent so many years defining myself by others' expectations, but now I was finally able to ask myself the question I had never truly asked before. What do I want? And the answer, at first, was simple. I wanted peace. I wanted to heal. I wanted to be okay. But as I started to put the pieces back together, I realized that there was something more, something even deeper. I wanted freedom. Freedom to live life on my own terms. Freedom to explore new passions. Freedom to find happiness in the small moments without needing anyone to validate my worth. Months turned into a year, and during that time, I continued to rebuild. I had days of doubt, days when the shadows of my past crept back in, but each time I reminded myself that I had survived. I had overcome the worst, and now I was the one who controlled the narrative of my life. My relationship with Paul had blossomed in ways that I hadn't expected, but it was different from anything I had experienced before. We weren't rushing into anything. We didn't need to. There was no pressure to live up to some romantic ideal. It wasn't about needing someone to fill a void. It was about companionship, mutual respect, and the space to grow together. We supported each other in ways I hadn't known were possible, and that, in itself, felt like a gift. What I realized in all this was that I didn't need someone else to complete me. I had always been complete. I had just forgotten that along the way. As I sat in the park one afternoon, looking around at the life I had built for myself, it struck me how much had changed in just a few years. I had gone from being the wife of a man who betrayed me to a woman who had found her strength, her independence, and her peace. The journey wasn't easy, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. The wind rustled through the trees, and I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. I had come so far, further than I had ever imagined, and there was still so much to look forward to. The future didn't scare me anymore. I didn't need to fear being alone. I didn't need to fear what would come next, because I knew that whatever it was, I would handle it. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow across the park, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't looking back. I wasn't holding on to the past. I was looking ahead, toward the life I was creating step by step. I had found a sense of peace that I didn't know I was capable of, and I was proud of who I had become. I stood up, feeling the cool grass beneath my feet, and began to walk slowly back home. I was no longer defined by the mistakes of others, or by the years I had spent trying to please someone who could never truly see me. I was free. I was finally free to live life on my own terms, to chase my dreams, to laugh without guilt, and to love without fear. The woman I had once been had been through the fire, but she had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more ready than ever to embrace everything life had to offer. And as I walked into my apartment, ready to continue this beautiful new chapter, I realized that I had everything I needed. I was enough. I had always been enough. And for the first time, I felt truly, deeply free. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.